So tonight is class 10 and it's two sections. Mostly we'll be dealing with section 31, which is chapter 12, the woman, the dragon and the man-child. And right at the end, we'll just briefly look at our continuing series on the history of the Roman Empire, but that's going to be very quick. So chapter 12, it's one of those chapters which, again, the churches make a total mess of it because when they look at chapter 12, they see the supernatural devil having a war in heaven, which of course it's got nothing to do with that. And hopefully, as we look at tonight, we'll see what these symbols all mean. Because again, one of the big traps they fall into is that they take symbols literally. Now, what do we got to remember about chapter 12 is that it talks about a woman giving birth to a man-child. It's not talking about Christ himself, but an imposter who pretended to be a Christ-like figure. And the history that we're going to do with tonight has been covered to a certain extent in chapter 6, the sixth seal, which is how Constantine became the first Christian emperor. So, as we said, this chapter forms the second half of the book. We're taken back to the sixth seal and to the revolution of Constantine, which abolished the pagan government in the Roman Empire and established a Christian system. Now, the question we ask is that why do we now go back in time to the time of Constantine? Why now are we going back and talking about really the same sort of thing? Well, there's two probable reasons. First, because when we looked at last week in chapter 11, chapter 11 introduced us to something called the beast. It's introduced in Revelation 11 verse 7. Now, that's the first time it actually talks about a beast in Revelation. So now what the book of Revelation does in chapter 12 and also chapter 13, it talks about how this beast system arose. So that's one of the reasons why we're going back in time. And the second reason is because now we're going to focus more on the religious aspect of the Roman Empire and also on the impact on the believers in Christ. Now, I've got a chart coming up which I think shows this. As we said, as you can see here, the book of Revelation is a book of two halves. You can see on the top level there, it mentions those chapters up to chapter 11, and that talks about the political development of the Roman Empire. And now we're reaching down the bottom grey chart. We're looking at, starting at chapter 12, the religious development of the Roman Empire and the impact on the believers in Christ. So you can see there's a similarity because in chapter 6 and verse 13 and also chapter 12 verse 4, it talks about the stars of heaven falling to the earth. And it's talking really about the same instance. We're talking about the time when the Emperor Constantine became the first Christian emperor of Rome, and that was a earth-shattering event. So we begin today, as we said, we're reaching the second half of the book of Revelation, the last chapters from chapter 12 to chapter 22. So as we said in the introduction, in Revelation 11 verse 7, which we looked at last week, there's a verse there which talked about this beast that ascended out of the bottomless pit and shall make war against the witnesses and shall overcome them and kill them. So as we said, it introduces a beast system, and now chapter 12 and chapter 13 are going to unfold more detail of how this beast system arose throughout the ages. And it uses the language of Daniel chapter 7. So as we said, why are we going back to the same events of history, which was already considered in chapter 6 of Revelation? Was because we are now looking at it from a different perspective. Namely, we're looking at how the Roman Empire affected the true believers, and we're going to focus more on the religious aspect. Now, this is familiar to us when we look at the book of Daniel, because when we look at Daniel, when we read, for example, Daniel 2, it describes the history of the world, the empires that come right down to the coming of Christ and the establishing of God's kingdom. And those visions in Nebuchadnezzar's image are really looking at it through man's point of view. It's looking through how Nebuchadnezzar saw it. He saw it as this shiny image of different metals, which is destroyed by a stone. But then we have that same really period again described in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, but it's given to us in the same history, but in more detail and a different perspective. Because in Daniel 7, as you're probably aware, that instead of the 4 metals, we got 4 wild beasts, 4 wild animals. And that's the reason we've got that is because it's looking at the kingdoms of men from God's perspective. God sees the kingdoms of men, these empires, as wild animals, because that's what they were, spiritually speaking. Now, one of the links, a very important link of Daniel to Revelation 12 is Daniel's 4th beast, because he appears in Revelation 12. And you might remember that in Daniel 7, the 4th beast is said to have 10 horns. And that 4th beast represented the Roman Empire. So we see that again in Revelation 12, verse 3, which we've got on the screen there in red. It says, there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. So you can see here the link that Revelation 12 is borrowing the figures and the symbols from Daniel chapter 7. And it's talking about the Roman Empire. Now, we'll start with the first verse, which is Revelation 12, verse 1, which says, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, as you can see that at the bottom of that screen, it's saying that the final picture is presented first. So this verse 1 is saying what happened at the end of the events that are all recorded in chapter 12. You've got the final picture, and the final picture is that you've got this woman who's clothed with the sun. She's got the moon under her feet, and she's got a head of 12 stars. So it's actually saying that this woman is as we're going to see, a religious system which has reached its pinnacle. It's reached political power within the Roman Empire. That's what has happened. This is the final picture. And now as we look through Revelation 12, the rest of it, it tells us how this happened, the processes of what happened. So we got the 12 stars. That represents the emperors, because there were about 12 emperors right up to the time of when John wrote the book of Revelation. The sun is again talking about the political authority of the Roman Empire, and the moon represents the state religion. And what was going to happen is that this religious system was going to overtake the previous religious system of the Roman Empire, which was paganism. Now, there's a lesson there for us as we got there to remain separate from political involvement. We don't get involved in politics, as we probably all know. And unfortunately, what happened in the past is that Christians did get involved in politics, and that caused all sorts of problems, and they strayed from the truth. And once this happened also, as we're going to look at from Revelation 12, verse 6, it causes a division within the religious system. So let's again have a look at what this all represents. Now, as we said, the important thing there, which we've got there in yellow, talking about the heaven that this chapter is about, it's the heaven of this drama is Roman, because the 10-horned dragon, which is Daniel's 4th beast, appears in it. So this is a key important point, that we're not looking at the heaven where God dwells. We are looking at the political heavens, and this political heaven is a Roman political heaven, because it talks about the 10-horned dragon, which appears in Daniel's 4th beast, which is the Roman Empire. Now we're going to see that in that the woman will represent a religious organization. We'll look at that shortly. She's in the Roman heaven, and she's opposed by a dragon. She's clothed with the glory of the sun of the Roman heaven, and the moon, which previously reflected the pagan glory, is now under her foot. So she's victorious over paganism. And it says there the 12 Caesars form the crown of the Roman world. Now, it also mentions, as we now go to the next verse, which talks about that this woman, she was with a child, she was pregnant, and it says she was travailing in birth and she was pained to be delivered. We're going to look at that shortly. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, we just got a very brief description here, so we'll look at this briefly, a bit more detail in our next few slides. But we're going to see that it actually represents a corrupted religious system. Also, we're going to see about the woman being pregnant, that generally a woman is pregnant for about 280 days before she gives birth. And we're going to see that that is also representative of 280 years. And we believe that the time period is started off at AD 33, when she became pregnant, and it ended in AD 313, when Constantine got the political power. As we said, we'll look at that in the next few slides. So we said that the woman is pregnant. Well, that's because the woman represents the ecclesia or the church. Now we know this from 2 Corinthians 11 verses 2 and 3, and I've got a bit of an excerpt from that verse, as you can see there in the red. And this is the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthian ecclesia, and he said, "I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." So what the Apostle Paul meant by that he wanted the ecclesia to be a chaste virgin, to be pure, and he wanted the ecclesia to be pure until Christ returns, and then that's when the marriage actually takes place at Christ's return. So here we've got a system that's no longer a chaste virgin, it's pregnant, and so that means she represents a religious system or a corrupted form of Christianity. Now, what's interesting also is you can see here, that's the diagram, but on the right-hand side, you can see how the Catholic Church has actually used the symbol of revelation to apply to Mary. So they look at this as, Mary giving birth to Christ. That's what they would say, and they take up those symbols. So they're obviously astray, but in certain respects they are correct. That's actually represents the Catholic Church that has actually corrupted Christianity. So we can see here that this woman represents a religious system that has been now corrupted, no longer a chaste virgin, and has now gone astray from the truth. Now, when did this all begin? Now, we mentioned about the gestation period that a woman is generally pregnant for is around 280 days, not 280 years, 280 days. Now, we take that, of course, as a day for a year symbol, and we can probably see when this happened. And it's interesting that around AD 33 AD, this is when the early ecclesias were formed after Pentecost. That as the early ecclesias were formed, they started going astray. And the first recorded sin, we might say, in the new ecclesia after the preaching of Pentecost by the apostles, actually occurred in Acts chapter 5. And that's when Ananias and Sapphira lied to the apostles. And as a result of their lying regarding money that they contributed to the church or to the ecclesia, that God put them to death, and they both died. And what's interesting about that is actually the language that the Apostle Peter says to Ananias. He says, "Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart?" So notice he uses about the word conceive, or conception. So we might say this is the first sin in the ecclesia. And from this time onwards, as time went on, the ecclesia became more and more corrupted. More and more people became corrupt, until you reach the stage of 280 years later that it actually receives political power when Constantine becomes the first Christian emperor. So that's pretty amazing when you think about that time period actually fits out perfectly of when the ecclesia was started to be corrupt until it brought forth the man-child, we might say, is Constantine when he was born. Again, pretty amazing to see that in Scripture. Now, the Apostle Paul did warn, and the other apostles also, they warned a great deal about how there was danger of corruption in the ecclesia. We know even when the apostles were alive that there were problems with doctrine, all sorts of different problems, and Paul had to deal with some of that. The Apostle John had to deal with that, and so on. And so the Apostle Paul actually warned in 2 Thessalonians 2 about the time when there was going to be a great apostasy in the ecclesia, and a man of sin was going to arise and become powerful, and would oppose God. It would be a system of counterfeit Christianity. It looked like Christianity, but it wasn't. And that power would be destroyed by Christ at his return. Now, the Apostle Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he's taken away. So the Apostle Paul is saying, as we already saw from Ananias and Sapphira, that the ecclesia is already becoming corrupted in doctrine and practice. But he's saying that's already happening now, but there's something holding it back, something restraining the sinfulness in the ecclesia, that it didn't develop fully. So what was restraining really the false Christianity from taking power? And that was, the thing that was hindering it was paganism. Because while the Roman Empire was pagan, they actually persecuted the Christians. They persecuted the ecclesia and others as well. So that was holding it back. As long as paganism was in power in the Roman Empire, there's no way for the man of sin to be revealed, or the full extent of the apostasy to get power. So that was the thing that was holding back the apostasy, was the pagan Roman Empire. Now, we saw that woman, she was with child, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. So this woman, as we said, was a corrupt Christianity. She was travailing, she was in pain as she's about to give birth. Again, this is interesting because just before Constantine became the emperor, 10 years before that, Diocletian, the Emperor Diocletian, actually instituted a decree of persecution. As you can see here, it was during the Fifth Seal, the Great Diocletian persecution. It lasted for 10 years, and that was the last gasp, we might say, almost, of the pagan Roman Empire trying to eradicate Christianity from the Roman Empire. So again, we can see here that this woman is in pain with Christianity, apostate Christianity. She's in pain because it looks like she's almost going to be wiped out by this great persecution by Diocletian, the pagan Roman emperor. So as I got there, the Christian church felt that she might die if she did not give birth to a deliverer. But as we saw, that Constantine was shortly going to come on the scene, and he was going to end all the persecution after a certain number of wars, and he was going to deliver deliverance for the Christians. He was going to give them political power. So that's what Revelation 12 verse 5 says. She, that is this apostate system, was going to bring forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Again, this is using symbolic language. He didn't actually go up to heaven, but he went up to the throne of the Roman emperor. He was actually went up to the political heavens and became powerful. That's what Constantine did, and he was supported by the Christians. Now, again, as we said, the important thing about the dragon at this time, that is early on in Revelation, we're going to see that there's actually two dragons in chapter 12, which we'll explain shortly. There's actually going to be two dragons and three women, but just put that aside at the moment. But initially, the dragon that's described there in verse 3 of Revelation 12, it says there appeared another wonder in heaven, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. Now, again, we said that was the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire. That's based upon what we saw in Daniel chapter 7. But also, if you look at other parts of Revelation, it also identifies it with the Roman Empire. So the 7 heads, which are mentioned in verse 3, are explained in Revelation 17, verses 9 to 10, where it says, "Here is the mind that hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are yet 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet to come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space." So the 7 heads, we know, represents Rome, because Rome actually sits on 7 mountains. Okay, so that's one identification with Rome. And the other identification with Rome is that the Roman Empire actually had 7 forms of government. And they're mentioned there: regal, consular, dictatorial, decemviral, tribunal, imperial, and Gothic. And at the time of John, it was a 6th imperial head. And the heads are said to be crowned. Now, that's interesting. So again, we see these twofold identification with Rome. Rome's got is on 7 mountains geographically, and it's also the Roman Empire had 7 different forms of government. And David Zammit next week is going to tell us a bit more about some evidence for this 7 different types of Roman government. So make sure you come next week as well. Now, further proof about the dragon being a symbol of the pagan Roman Empire is that you can see there from the bottom of the screen that the legions, the Roman legions, actually had a dragon as one of their battle standards or battle flags. So you can see that they actually used that symbol for their legions. But it also says in verse 5 that this dragon, this pagan Roman dragon, when they found out about Constantine trying to get political power, they tried to destroy him and stop him from becoming emperor of all of the Roman Empire, especially since he was Christian. And we're going to see here how there was a war in heaven, war in the Roman Empire, and that various emperors tried to stop Christianity and stop Constantine from becoming emperor. Okay, so now in this map, it shows us a time period here, AD 306, and it's got 4 emperors, and the empire here is divided into 4 at this stage. You can see there on the far left, there's Constantius, then you've got Maxentius, Licinius, and Galerius. Now on the far left, Constantius, that's actually the father of Constantine the Great. Now, in AD 306, Constantius actually died. That's the father of Constantine. So Constantine became the emperor. So now he's actually on the scene as a Christian emperor on the 4th of the empire. And a lot of the emperors, especially Maxentius and Galerius, the pagan, these are all pagan, the ones on the right, they didn't like it and tried to stop him. So I've got here that in this case, the dragon represents Galerius and Maxentius, who tried to stop Constantine and, before he, as it says here, to devour her child as soon as it was born. So as soon as Constantine became one of the emperors, they tried to destroy him and fought battles against him. So, and one of the big battles here was in AD 312, when Constantine, on the far left, he fought with Maxentius, who was a ruler of Italy. So he fought against him and he defeated him. So now Constantine has defeated one of the pagan Roman emperors, and he got a great deal of power as a result of this. You might remember that this battle was called the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which is just outside Rome. You can see the bridge there on the left-hand side. I don't think it's probably the same bridge, but there's a bridge there anyway now. And you might remember from history that Constantine claimed he saw a vision of a cross in the sky saying, "In this sign conquer." And he put that sign on the soldiers' shields. And so he saw that victory as a sign that God was with him and that this was a victory over Christ, over paganism. That's how Constantine saw it. And remember, Constantine was had a lot of support by the Christians, and actually Christians were actually flocking to his armies and were prepared to fight for him. Now we come to the next verse, which talks about, in verse 4, it says that in his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. So at this stage now, as we said, once Constantine defeated Maxentius, he got a third of the empire. Licinius has got a third, and on the far right, there's another emperor called Maximin. Now, in 312 and 313, Licinius and Constantine got together and published the decree of toleration. So they said, we're going to stop persecuting the Christians, basically. So the Christians got a lot of support from this, and persecution stopped. But a third of the empire, under Maximin, he was a paganism. He was a champion of paganism, and he said, no, I'm going to still persecute the Christians. So he was a paganism. So here we can see that the tail of the dragon getting rid of a third. And so what happened was that Maximin was the next person to be taken out of the way, fulfilling that verse, that a third part of the pagan empire there of the stars was taken out of the way. He was defeated. So what is it starting to look like now? Well, now it's starting to look like there's only two emperors left in the Roman Empire, and both at this stage are supporting the Christians. It seems like it at this stage, but things were going to change. And later on, Constantine actually took on 2/3 of the empire, and Licinius was left with a third. So again, we've got these verses which are describing all these things that are happening, which says there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was a place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceived the whole earth, the whole world. He was cast out on the earth, and the angels were cast out with him. So again, this is talking in a symbolic language. It's talking about the war. Michael here again representing Constantine as the Christian emperor, and he's having this war against paganism. And eventually he was able to, with a series of wars, defeat all the pagan emperors and cast them out. And so that the whole Roman world became Christian. So as I got there, by AD 314, Constantine gained control of 2/3 of the Western Empire, and Licinius, he was the emperor of the Eastern third. But as time went on, there was tensions were starting to arise between Constantine and Licinius. As we remember, Licinius initially supported Constantine in not persecuting the Christians, but later on, Licinius, who had 1/3 of the empire, became a champion of paganism. So like Maximin before him, he became the pagan tail that drew the third part of the stars in heaven. So further battles were going to be fought, and again, eventually Constantine also defeated Licinius and got control of all the empire. So I've just got there, that's what it talks about there. There was a war in heaven. Michael fought against a dragon. So again, that's talking in symbolic language, Constantine fighting against Licinius and eventually being victorious over him. Now, what's interesting about Licinius is just before the final battle, remember he's representing paganism, that he got all his friends and his soldiers together and he made a big speech. And the speech there is on the left, which I'm going to read out now and explain what he's saying. He says, "Friends and fellow warriors, these are the gods of our ancestors," that is the pagan gods, "whom received from our earliest predecessors as objects of worship we honour. But he who commands the army that is drawn up against us," that is Constantine, "having adopted an atheistic opinion," that is Christianity, "violates the customs of the fathers, venerating a god from abroad. I know not whence, and disgraces his troops with the ignominious standard, the cross with the monogram of Christ. trusting in which he arms not so much against us as against the gods whom he offends. If the foreign god whom we now deride should appear the mightiest, we must acknowledge and honour him and bid farewell to these to whom we have vainly lit wax tapers. Now, just to try to explain what he's saying in that blurb, he's actually saying that Licinius sees this battle between him and Constantine as a battle between the God of the Christians and the pagan gods. That's what he sees. He sees it as a competition, and he says, let's see who's going to win. If we win, that means the pagan gods are true, but if Constantine wins, that means Christ and God, they're the true God. So he actually says that before the battle, that this is a battle between Christianity and paganism. And we know that it was actually, and that's what Revelation 12 is all about. And unfortunately for Licinius, he lost that battle. And so Constantine, who was before in charge of 2/3 of the Roman Empire, now he's in charge of all the Roman Empire, and the pagan dragon is thrown out of the political heavens. So we've got this slide here, which I think also David put on a couple of weeks ago, which tells us about the time period of when Constantine became ruler of the Roman Empire. So we can see that he became ruler and part of the empire in 312 AD. 313 is the Edict of Milan, that's a toleration of Christianity. And then for the next 11 or 12 years, that's the war in heaven. That's when Constantine's fighting all these pagan emperors like Licinius and like Maxentius and defeating them. And 324, that's when we've got finally peace or silence in heaven, from 324 to 337 when Constantine dies. So Constantine, for half of his reign, he was fighting wars until there was peace in the Roman Empire, until paganism was completely destroyed. Now, what's also pretty amazing is what Constantine himself, he wrote a letter to Eusebius, who was a bishop, a Christian bishop in the East, and he also produced a gold coin. But let's just see what he wrote in this letter. He wrote this to a Christian bishop called Eusebius, and he says, notice how he talks about paganism. He says, that dragon, having been deposed from governance of affairs by God's providence, but now that liberty is restored, and that dragon, driven from administration of public affairs by the providence of the supreme deity and our instrumentality, we trust that all can see the efficacy of the divine power. So it's amazing here that Constantine actually uses the symbol of the dragon. He says, we've just driven the dragon from the government. And what's he talking about? He's talking about the paganism. Paganism has been defeated. So he's using, by his letter, he's actually using symbols from the book of Revelation, chapter 12, to say the dragon has been defeated. How has it been defeated? By the power of God. And not only does he do that, he actually produces a gold medal, which you can see here. That's Constantine, and that's the other side of the coin. Sorry, not a medal. And you can see here that's a Christian symbol there, and you can see it piercing the serpent or the dragon. So even in this, you can see that Constantine, by producing this gold coin, could see himself that Christianity, that's Christianity, piercing the serpent dragon, has been defeated. So again, that's exactly what Revelation 12 is saying. So again, people living at that time, true Christians living at that time, would have seen, wow, this is pretty amazing. This is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Now, in verses 10 and 11 of Revelation 12, which we'll just read out shortly, it says there, and I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. The accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. So what this verse is saying is this is what a lot of Christians were saying, this is what actually even Constantine was saying. We saw in that previous slide, Constantine saying, we can see here there's a witness that God is behind this. We've defeated paganism. The kingdom of God, now we've got the kingdom of God has been established. Not when Christ returns, but the kingdom of God has now been established now under this Christian emperor called Constantine. So as it says there in black, these verses describe the rejoicing of the Christians, the apostate Christians, at the extraordinary salvation brought by Constantine's victories, at the termination of their persecutions and their ascension to power and honour. So as a result of Constantine's victory and becoming the emperor of all of the empire, persecution of the Christians stopped. And not only that, but Constantine gave them political power and wealth as well. And so, again, the Christians saw this. This must be the kingdom of God on earth. And that's exactly what they say, as we're going to see shortly. So that person, that bishop of Ephesus, called Eusebius, to which Constantine had written a letter, this is what he says in the next slide about what happened when Constantine became the sole Christian emperor. He says this event surpassed all worlds. Soldiers with naked swords kept watch around the palace gate, but the men of God passed through the midst of them without fear and entered the heart of the palace. And they sat down, some at the emperor's table, the rest at tables on either side of his. It looked like the very image of the kingdom of Christ and was altogether more like a dream than a reality. So that's what that Christian bishop wrote in his book called The Ecclesiastical History. He said, now all the Christians and the bishops can go and eat at the emperor's table. And he said, it looks like the image of the kingdom of Christ. So that's what they thought. And because they've got now, the Christian church has got all this political power, all this wealth from Constantine, the millennial reign of Christ is now not that important. As they've got the millennial reign of Christ and his return to earth was becoming a dim idea, and the language thought of as figurative. The rapidly growing concept was the church was the kingdom of God, and Constantine's success encouraged the idea. So as a result of this, the future millennial reign of Christ went down the gurgler. And we know there's that famous quote by Edward Gibbon that says the same sort of thing. Because the apostate Christians saw that they've got this political power from the Roman Empire. They thought, what do we need Christ to come back and set up a kingdom? We're already in the kingdom now. So again, this is just shows how corrupt the church had come. Now, we mentioned earlier about the dragon, that there are actually, in Revelation 12, there are 2 dragons, and there's actually going to be 3 women. Now, we'll talk about the 3 women a bit later on. But I've highlighted, well, I haven't, I borrowed this from another brother, but if you've got your Bible, it might be handy to colour this in, but I've got there in red, which is actually the great red dragon. That's talking about, in those verses there, that's actually talking about the pagan Roman Empire. But later on, it was going to change to be a Christian Roman Empire, but it was still going to be a dragon. And that it's highlighted there in blue. So where you see there, for example, the man-child and Michael, that's referring to Constantine, Christian Constantine. And later on at the end of chapter 12, where it talks about the serpent, the dragon, and also the dragon in chapter 13, it's still a dragon, but it's a Christian dragon. So as we said, the dragon doesn't disappear. The dragon changes from pagan to Christian. So that's a very important point to note. As I've got there, the dragon doesn't die, it changes. Many of the institutions, the festivals and doctrines of paganism were superimposed upon the Christian church in order to attract those that previously opposed it. So we know under Constantine, festivals like Christmas, worshipping on a Sunday, and sort of things like that, and other worshipping idols and images, and many other things which come from paganism, suddenly found themselves in the Christian church. So the church became a state-sponsored, paganised form of Christianity, and many of the previous pagans flocked to it. And so this new apostate Christianity, or we might call it the Catholic Church, she bitterly opposed those who refused to conform. And so those who resisted that, who didn't want to be part of this apostate Christianity, they were persecuted. So as it says there, thus as a paganized Christianity had supplanted the original paganism, so now the symbols of the serpent and dragon related to the Christianized empire. So there was a transformation. It's still a dragon. Before it was a pagan dragon. Now it's a Christian or a Catholic dragon, we might say. And the other thing about the dragon is that later on, in AD 330, Constantine, the emperor, he actually transferred his civil and military headquarters from Rome to Constantinople, previously called Byzantium, the centre of pagan resistance. And so he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople. And then from then on, it says the dragon became identified with the civil and military power of the Christianized empire in Constantinople. So that's where the dragon eventually moves to. It moves as a military power in Constantinople. And as it says there, it was from the face of this pseudo-Christian serpent dragon that the woman fled. And we're going to deal with now the woman. So we've seen there, as we said, there's two dragons. There's the pagan dragon becomes a Christian or a Catholic dragon. Now we're going to look at the woman. So in verses 13 to 15 of Revelation 12, it says the following. It says, and when the dragon saw that he was cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of an eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into a place where she was nourished for a time and times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. As the serpent cast out of its mouth water as a flood after the woman. So we can see here that there's a time period when persecution was going to come again on the Roman Empire. But this time it's not going to be done by a pagan Roman Empire. It's going to be done by the Christian Roman Empire, because they had the political power. So once the Catholic Church got its political power, they started persecuting any other religious groups that opposed it. And so we've got here that this is woman. So these other Christians that didn't want to be Catholics, it says they were given 2 wings, symbolic sense, and she went into the wilderness. So she actually tried to escape by going out to the extremities of the Roman Empire. So I've got that explained, I think, in the next slide. So this woman fleeing in the wilderness, it says the protesting section of the church found it necessary to flee to the wilderness. They sought refuge in the extremities of the empire, the wings of the great eagle of the Roman Empire, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 49. This second woman represents that section of the Christian community which refused to conform to the general attitude of the Catholic Church in supporting Constantine. Any dissenting Christians were being persecuted by Constantine and the Catholic Church. So now again, I've got chapter 12 here highlighted, the 3 women of Revelation 12. So we saw 2 dragons, 3 women. Now the orange, the one you described in orange there, you can see that in the first part of chapter 12 in verses 1, 2, and 4 and 5, and also in verse 13. That woman there is actually talking about, we might say, the Catholic Church. The woman in green, which is the woman that flees into the wilderness, that's actually, we might say, the protesting Christians, or Christians that protested the teaching of the Catholic Church, and they didn't agree, and they were being persecuted by the Catholic Church. They tried to flee away. But then there's actually a third woman, we might say, and it's right at the end of verse 17. It's called the remnant of her seed, the remnant of the woman's seed, and that's actually talking about the true followers of Christ. So we'll talk about that also in the next few slides. Okay, so the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, and they should feed there 1,260 days. Now, you might remember that we talked about this time period also in Revelation 11, verse 3, about the two witnesses that they also had to witness, and that they had to also prophesy for the same period, 1,260 days, each day for a year. And we saw that began in 312. That's when Constantine became the first Christian emperor. You add 1260 days or 1260 years, and you got 1572, which is a slaying of the witnesses beginning, which is the putting to death of the Protestants at the Bartholomew's Day massacre. So, as we said, the women, these are a group of protesting Christians that tried to flee from the persecution of the Catholic Church. And some of the things they said, as you can see down the bottom of that slide, these that opposed the Catholic Church, they said, what has the emperor to do with the church, and what have Christians to do with kings, and what have bishops to do at court? So they really maintained a similar position that we do, that we don't get involved as religious believers with politics and with the ruling powers. And that's what they were saying. We don't want political power. And so this is a time of, as you said, of persecution, that time period which we looked at previously in the two witnesses, and the treading underfoot of the true worshippers in Revelation 11. So we mentioned again last class about Revelation 11, talked about the two witnesses and the holy city, and we said that these two witnesses were going to be prophesying for 1260 days, and the woman was going to be fleeing for 1260 days. And the two witnesses, I think we mentioned also last week, in the book of Revelation 12, they are represented as these two classes called the earth and the woman. And the woman is actually the religious classes of protesting Christians, and the earth, we might say, is a political class which tried to help these people that were running away or opposing the Catholic Church. So in this slide here, we've got actually some of the groups that people have found of protesting Christians that didn't want anything to do with the Catholic Church. And so we've got, for example, the Donatists, who are in North Africa. There's the Albigenses, the Waldenses, Paulicians, and others. And these are just some that are mentioned. There's no doubt there's many others that are not written down in history. And so these tried to go as far away towards the outskirts of the empire to escape the persecution of the Catholic Church. And Gibbon writes certain things about them. He says they had an intense zeal for purity of living and separation from worldly affairs. And it says about these other Christian groups that they were denied political recognition. They were excluded from civil and religious communion of the state church. So the state church, which is Catholicism, they had nothing to do with these groups. And in fact, they persecuted them and tried to eradicate them. And that's why they had to escape, were given wings, as it were, to go to the wilderness of the Roman Empire. Now, we know here that we said the woman system here, the second woman is the protesting Christians, and they were helped by a group of people called the earth. Now, we've got there from Revelation 12, verse 15, the verse which says, and the serpent, or the dragon, cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause it to be carried away with the flood. So symbolically, this serpent, or the dragon, the Catholic Roman Empire, tried to destroy this woman system, these protesting Christians. And symbolically, a flood really represents warfare or violence. And you can see there from a quote from Jeremiah 46, verse 8, where Egypt rises like a flood and his waters are moved like rivers. And he said, I will go up, I will cover the earth, I will destroy the city and the inhabitants. So the flood represents armies and violence used to destroy people. So, but we can see here that whilst this serpent was casting out this flood, it says the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood. So this Earth system, this Earth, actually was a group of people who were more politically motivated, who also didn't like the Catholic Church for other reasons, because not religious reasons, but because of political reasons. And they actually supported these protesting Christians and fought against the Catholic powers. And one example is, from history we know, is this group of people called the Circumcellions of North Africa. Okay, we'll just go through some of these slides quickly as we're coming to an end. So who was the Earth? Well, there's people like the Circumcellions in North Africa. They defended religious groups like the Donatists, and they opposed the armies of Rome. So they, as is said, have swallowed up the flood sent by the dragon. They swallowed up the persecution, and they helped these dissenting Christians. And so the earth and the woman in the wilderness therefore represent the two witnesses of Revelation 11, which we saw last week. Now, it talks about these Circumcellions here, that they helped the Donatists. What's interesting here, it says that they used clubs to fight, because it says, because Jesus said he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, the Circumcellions used clubs instead, which is sort of trying to get around what Christ said literally, but of course that's still wrong. You can't club people to death, but not kill them by the sword. But it's interesting they call their clubs Israelites, but that's what they used to help to fight against those Roman powers that were persecuting these dissenting Christians. Now, whilst it's happening, again, it's interesting what some of these protesting Christians wrote. And again, they use symbols which are found in the book of Revelation chapter 12. So you can see there that verse we got on the top of the screen there, Revelation 12 verse 16, which says, the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So look at what this Marculus, a Donatist writer, writes. It's quoted in Eureka. He says, suddenly the polluted flood of the Macarian persecution burst forth from the tyrannical church of King Constans, and two beasts being sent to Africa from thence, to wit, Macarius and Paulus, a most horrible and cruel ecclesiastical war was proclaimed, that a Christian people should be compelled by the naked swords of soldiers, by the standards of serpents and dragons, and by the blast of trumpets to unite with traditors. So here we can see this was written this happened during the time of Constans, who was the son of Constantine. And you can see the words he used. He says there's a flood of persecution from the Roman Empire, and this came from a group which he calls by the standards of serpents, dragons. So he actually uses terms in Revelation 12. No doubt he saw this flood and the dragons as the symbols of the Catholic Roman Empire that were trying to destroy dissenting Christians. So it's pretty amazing, again, that this writer uses symbols found in Revelation 12 to describe what was happening at that time. He could see it happening by reading his Bible. Again, pretty amazing. So, and just finally, the third woman, as we said, is the remnant of her seed, the remnant of the woman's seed. And this is a small group. These were those who held the truth in its purity, and these were ones that will be in the kingdom. And down throughout the ages, there were many different communities, different names, who have stood for the truth until they've been overwhelmed by opposition or by apostasy. But this remnant of the seed will eventually triumph when they are found in God's kingdom. Okay, and that just brings us to our last section, which we're going to look at very, very briefly, which is History of the Roman Empire, Part 3. We're just going to look at just some of the significant events. So 330 AD, which we saw, Emperor Constantine moves his capital to Constantinople, and in absence of an emperor, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, gains power. In 476 AD, Adoacer, he overthrew the last Western Roman emperor. The sixth imperial head sustains a deadly wound, and Adoacer and his successor Theodoric the Goth rule from Ravenna in northern Italy. Rome declines in importance, but the Bishop of Rome becomes the ruler of the city. In 493 AD, Theodoric murders Adoacer at the feast and commences the rule of the seventh Gothic head. 529 AD, Emperor Justinian recognises the Bishop of Rome as universal bishop of the Catholic Church. 552 AD, Emperor Justinian reconquers most of Italy. The deadly wound was healed, and as the imperial head was restored for a short period. 608 AD, Emperor Phocas declares Rome to be head of all the churches. There's Phocas. So through the help of the emperors of Constantinople, the Christian emperors, the papacy gained its prestige and power. Rome was now the religious centre, whereas Constantinople was the military headquarters of the Roman Empire. So as we said before, Constantinople becomes the dragon, the military power of the Roman Empire, whereas Rome was a religious centre. So just a final quote here from this illustrated world history, which is quite good. It says, in the West, that is the Western Empire, as the sun set over the temporal power of Rome, the papacy emerged as the heir of a new empire, Christendom. Little by little, the Roman See made itself supreme in temporal as in spiritual matters. Indeed, Gregory, 590-604, while insisting on the primacy of Rome over other churches, also ruled and defended Italy as a latter-day emperor. And as he says in red there, the popes could thus consider themselves as heir to ancient Rome. So what this encyclopedia says, that the papacy eventually, the popes got power just like the emperors, just like the Roman emperors in the West. And they ruled with power as well, because the Western Empire had collapsed and the military power was in the East, in Constantinople. So really, as we conclude, we can say, what's the lesson for us? Well, the lesson for us, I guess, when we look at this, the problems of what happened to Christianity when they got involved in politics and they went astray from the truth, that we've got to be like that remnant of the woman's seed. We've got to stand apart from any involvement in politics and government, and also stand apart from any false doctrine which can infect us. So let us be part of that remnant of the woman. That's really us in these last days. Let us remain faithful right until the end, until Christ's return.